All right, Alexander, let's talk about dirty bombs. Dirty bombs. That's what everyone is talking about. At least that's what Shoigu is talking about. He made a bunch of calls to, let's see, Turkish defense minister, French defense minister, Lloyd Austin of the Pentagon twice, and I think he called Ben Wallace. Did he call Ben
He,
Wallace or
he,
not?
he, he, he did indeed.
Okay.
And previously, he's had a correspondence with Ben Wallace.
Okay.
It's all very intriguing, by the way.
Okay, so I'll pass it off to you, but just one quick interesting fact that I read. I don't know if maybe it's not important. The first call that Shoigu made to the Pentagon, from what I understand, the Pentagon initiated that call. Then came the dirty bomb story. From what I understand, Russia initiated that call. Anyway, what do you think of
This is all very interesting, and let's just discuss the calls, the sequence of the calls, because it's very interesting. Now, last week, in the middle of the political crisis which we have in Britain, and we are in the middle of a major political crisis, though it's probably going to find some kind of temporary resolution in a few hours, but we'll discuss that later. In the middle of the political crisis, Ben Wallace, British Defence Secretary, announced, "I am flying to Washington." Completely unexpected, no explanation for it, except he said, "Our communications with Washington have been compromised." Now, that implies that somebody is listening in to British American calls, which is amazing in itself. But what is even more amazing is that Ben Wallace, the British Defence Secretary, actually tells the world that is the case. I mean, this is all very strange. I mean, normally, if something as sensitive as British and American telephone conversations between defense secretaries being compromised had happened, you would expect the Americans and the British to want to keep that secret, given how important the alliance between Britain and America is, especially to the British. Anyway, he flies to Washington. He has talks with Lloyd Austin. Lloyd Austin then telephones Shoigu, and they have the conversation. At the same time, Ben Wallace writes to Shoigu about an incident over the Black Sea when a Russian fighter jet launched a missile in close proximity to a British surveillance aircraft. The Shoigu writes back, we don't know what went on between Shoigu and Austin at that point, except that they apparently agreed to keep in touch. Then Shoigu writes back to Wallace, tells Wallace, "Look, this is all a technical malfunction. We're very sorry. Nothing was intentional. And we accept it happened. This incident with the fighter jet launching the missile happened over international waters." Wallace accepts the explanation, makes rather a conciliatory statement to the House of Commons about it. Then, a few hours later, we get news that there's another conversation. This time, it's Shoigu calling Austin, telling Austin about this dirty bomb. Okay, this dirty bomb, this threat of a dirty bomb. And then Shoigu goes on a whole marathon of calls. He calls the Turkish Defense Secretary, who is apparently very receptive to this. And there are some rumors that the Turks are now allowing Russian submarines, additional Russian submarines, into the Black Sea because they're nervous about threats of sabotage to the Turk Stream pipeline. So Shoigu calls the Turkish Defense Secretary. He calls the French Defense Secretary. He calls the British Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace again, and he also calls Lloyd Austin. So after months of no interaction between any of these people with each other, between Shoigu and any of these people, suddenly we have this somewhat mysterious flurry of calls. Now, just about a week ago, we had an interview on Russian television with a new Russian commander of the forces in Ukraine, the forces that are conducting the war, General Surovikin. And General Surovikin says that Ukraine is preparing to use prohibited means to prosecute the war. It's one of the things that he said over the course of that interview. Now, when he said it, I assumed it was something to do with an attempt to attack the dam over the Dnieper, the Novaya Kakhovka dam. We've heard lots about that. But that wouldn't have been, it seems to me, a prohibited act of war. So I just didn't understand that. I'm assuming that this was all related to the dirty bomb. And I'm starting to think that what is behind not just the latest series of calls, but also Wallace's trip to Washington, his discussion with Lloyd Austin, all of this is in some way and in some form related to a dirty bomb. And note that the sequence begins with some kind of concerns in London that their conversations with Washington have been compromised. Now, I don't want to, draw too many deductions from all of this. There's an awful lot here that isn't easy to understand. But clearly, there's been a flurry of concern from various sources. We had Surovikin's statement. We had Wallace's flight to Washington. We've had Lloyd Austin calling Shoigu. We've then had Shoigu calling Austin, the Turkish Defense Secretary, the French Defense Secretary, the British Defense Secretary. We've had exchanges of letters between Wallace and Shoigu. I think it's all connected with this dirty bomb thing. And overnight, because I was skeptical about the dirty bomb thing yesterday, overnight, I'm starting to wonder whether maybe perhaps something is indeed happening on that front. Because why would all these people be talking to each other in this way? Why would the Pentagon be initiating calls? Why would Wallace be flying to Washington in that kind of way? Something is going on, and I suspect this dirty bomb thing is at the root of it.
For Shoigu to call all of these defense ministers, the French, the British, and the American, would suggest to me that they're not in favor of, they're not behind Ukraine, perhaps having a dirty bomb. We don't know if they have a dirty bomb, but it seems to me like they're not pushing Ukraine to develop a dirty bomb. They would actually probably be against Ukraine using a dirty bomb. So I wonder if all of the media spin over the past couple of months about tactical nukes and all of this stuff, which was meant just to be media spin. I wonder if there are various forces in Ukraine that kind of got the wrong idea with regards to the media spin, misunderstood collective West American soft media power and how they like to spin stories like this, even though they could be complete fiction. And they said, oh, well, we have the capabilities to create a dirty bomb, and it looks like this is what the collective West would like us to do. This is what they're talking about all the time. So let's do it. I wonder if there was some kind of, like I could see the collective West. I can see Austin calling up Zelensky and saying, you guys, that was just meant for media spin. We didn't mean for you guys to actually go ahead and start to think about developing this.
Right.
I wonder if there was something like that happened.
But three things to say about this. Firstly, Ukraine has the capabilities to create a dirty bomb. I mean, I think we need to make that absolutely clear. A dirty bomb, as I understand it, is not an explosive nuclear device. It is a device which uses radioactive elements, can cause lots of damage. It's an ugly thing. It's certainly prohibited, but there's no doubt at all that Ukraine has that capability and could probably do it pretty fast. So that's the first thing to say. The second is that I am absolutely sure that you are right. I think that the Western powers would not support use by Ukraine of a dirty bomb. In fact, I'm quite sure that the militaries of all of these powers, and notice it's the militaries that are in touch with each other. It's Shoigu, who's the defense minister, and he's talking to the defense ministers of Turkey, Britain, France, and the United States. It's not Lavrov, it's not the foreign ministry. So it's the militaries in all of these countries would be horrified at the use of this. I mean, if something like that happened, it would be a major, weakening, if you like, of the nuclear threshold. I think they would be dead against it. And this is where it becomes interesting, because a couple of days ago, well, in fact, a little longer than that, we had Zelensky giving an interview. I think it was to Australian media, but I can't remember where it was, in which he said that if the Russians do something with nuclear weapons, and a dirty bomb is pretty close to being a nuclear weapon, if the Russians do something with nuclear weapons, there ought to be preemptive strikes against Russia. The West ought to organize such strikes. And of course, very quickly, there was an outcry about this. He tried to dial down what he said, but there's no doubt at all as to his original meaning, at least not in my mind. So if you want to put all of these pieces together, you arrive at a conclusion very similar to the one that you expressed when you posed these questions to me, in the sense that we've had endless spin over the last months about the Russians using tactical nuclear weapons. The Russians have repeatedly said that's not on their agenda at all. That's not what they are intending to do. Then you have Zelensky's comments, which are very disturbing. And you also have the capability. Ukraine has that capability. And it's not impossible. In fact, it's entirely plausible, given that what Ukraine has been trying to do ever since the war started was to get the Western powers directly involved in the war. That's the only way, realistically, that they can win this war. I mean, they can win a few tactical successes here and there, but ultimately, anybody knows that the clock is ticking against them, that, there's hundreds of thousands of Russian troops coming. There's major rearmament on the Russian side going on. Their infrastructure is coming under massive attack. The amount of Western weapons is dwindling. Their economy is in a mess. So the only way, ultimately, that they can find a way back from this would be, or so they think, to try to get the West involved. So, dirty bomb, provoke a reaction from the West, draw the West into the conflict. You can see that that might be something that somebody in Kiev, perhaps Zelensky, perhaps his media advisors, perhaps even his military advisors, might be contemplating. Now, I want to stress, it's not something we know, but it's highly likely that the Russians believe that that is what Zelensky and what they call the regime in Kiev might be up to. And of course, they might have intelligence that points in that direction also. And of course, if they have that intelligence, it may be right, it may be wrong. And, there are reasons to see why they might think it's right. They've done entirely the correct thing, which is to call the Western governments, the Western defense ministers, and to alert them to the fact. And probably before Shoigu made the calls, at some level, the Russians have been sharing their intelligence with some of these militaries, Western militaries, and that probably that may explain the reason for Wallace's very mysterious dash to Washington. So what I'm saying is, I think your question, I mean, we can't say definitely it's the truth, but it's entirely plausible that the Russians would think it's the truth. And I have to be frank, it's the kind of thing that I can imagine very easily some people in Ukraine doing.
Yeah, the key is that you had Shoigu calling the defense ministers of countries that are actively arming and funding this war against Russia. I mean, France, the UK, and the United States. After months of silence, all of a sudden, he's on the phone with these defense ministers, and he's warning them. I mean, that's the key. This wasn't a statement from the foreign ministers. This wasn't a statement from Russian media or anything like that. This was Shoigu, the defense minister's pretty low key and quiet. I mean, he doesn't really say much. And the first call with Austin that they had, where the U.S. initiated the call, there wasn't really much information as to what they discussed.
Absolutely.
But the second call, we're getting this flood of information
Absolutely.
about dirty bombs. So even if Ukraine isn't on the road to creating a dirty bomb, even if they haven't done such a thing, obviously the Russians believe that they are about to do such a thing, and I imagine, yeah, they probably have intel that may even indicate that there are plans for a dirty bomb, and so they're trying to preempt it. The interesting thing about Zelensky is that he's actually talked about dirty bombs before.
Yes, yes. I mean, he has it on the brain. He has all this business of nuclear weapons on the brain. He talked about it in Munich, during the Munich Security Conference at the start of this year, before the conflict began. I mean, he's been harping on about all of this, and which, as you correctly say, makes the whole idea of, floating the idea of tactical nuclear weapons being used in Ukraine, which Western governments have been doing. It makes it incredibly reckless. But it's important to say this, and it's an important point that you've just made. It's not the Russians who've been talking about nuclear weapons being used in Ukraine. It's the Ukrainians. Now, sometimes they attribute that to the Russians. Sometimes they're talking about, wouldn't it be nice if we had nuclear weapons ourselves? And, the situation would never have arisen if we had done. And they give a, frankly, very misleading account of what happened with the Budapest memorandum. They've been trying to say that they gave up nuclear weapons. Let me reiterate, Ukraine has never possessed nuclear weapons. There were nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory when Ukraine declared its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. But at all times, those nuclear weapons were under Moscow's control. And the Russian authorities, replacing the Soviet authorities, brought them back to Russia. So, I mean, Ukraine has never given up nuclear weapons. It never had any. But the way Zelensky talks, the way many people in Ukraine talk, you'd get the opposite impression. And Zelensky's been harping on about this all the time. And absolutely, I mean, it's entirely possible that all this talk about tactical nuclear weapons and the West reacting and destroying the Russian army in Ukraine, if tactical nuclear weapons are going to be used, all of these reckless language that we've seen, irresponsible language that we have seen in the West, it's entirely easy to see how it could have fed into all of this in Kiev itself and given rise to all sorts of dangerous and very reckless ideas, and why we've seen this panicky rush of Western officials and these conversations between Shoigu and those officials. I would add, and I think we have to say this, that of course you listen to the media, they're all saying that Austin and Wallace categorically denied that Ukraine had any plan to use dirty bombs. I take all of that with a massive pinch of salt. You wouldn't expect them to confirm that Ukraine was going to use a dirty bomb, given how much they've invested in Ukraine. But them saying it in that kind of way might also be considered as a warning to Ukraine. Under no circumstances do this thing.
Yeah, I mean, what else would we expect them to say?
Oh, well,
I mean,
exactly.
obviously, yeah. I mean, but Zelensky has been egged on by the collective West as well.
Yeah.
He talks about the tactical nukes, and he has mentioned that Ukraine can make dirty bombs. He said it in the past. I mean, he's being egged on as well by the West. But there's that misunderstanding of Ukraine misunderstanding the collective West media spin.
Yes, you see,
and they go ahead and they do it, and they say, okay, they want a tactical nuke, they want a nuclear bomb. Let's see if we can build it. That's what they want. They're going to cover for us too, because they always cover for us.
Yes. Yes. You see, this is where I also think it might even be a little worse than you say, because I'm absolutely sure that Western militaries would be resolutely opposed to use of a dirty bomb in Ukraine by Ukraine. I think it is inconceivable that the militaries would countenance this. I have to say this, I'm not so sure about everybody in London and especially in Washington. Some of these people there, the sort of neocons who are, circulating around, I can imagine them hatching some sort of crazy scheme like this. And it's not impossible because undoubtedly some of them are talking to people in Ukraine or Ukrainians all the time. It's not impossible that there's been some, messages sent which are more than, just misunderstood messages in Kiev that some people in Washington especially have been telling Ukraine, well, you might think about doing something like this, make sure it's not too big a bomb or something of that kind, but that will give us some leverage in this situation. I have to. I'm not saying, by the way, that that's happened. I want to make it very clear. I don't know that it has, but there are some people who, it seems to me, could be talking in that way. And if the military, of course, finds out about that in Washington, I think there will be a huge row, though unlikely that we'll ever find out about it.
All right. We'll leave it there. theduran.locals.com. You can find us on Rockfin as well. Duran Shop, 10% off. Use the code GOODDAY. Take care.